of Shanghai as a model throughout China and throughout East Asia, that is the circulation and dissemination of this Shanghai-style modernity. Just to quote one example, in Singapore in the late 1920s, 3 entertainment parks opened that were closely modeled after the Shanghai entertainment. They had the same names, 新世界, 大世界. So there is a very clear Shanghai connection there. So that means we have been talking about the creation of the Shanghai modernity, but I would be interested in what happens to these visual narratives once they are created. How are they disseminated? What is the impact that Shanghai has beyond the borders of Shanghai land? I don't know if anybody wants to address that.
Anyone? Joan?
Well, if you think of print, I mean, clearly, all of the journals that were published in Shanghai were disseminated to at least, 10 provinces outside, and some even to, the diaspora. So, there's much discussion of how real are these journals and what do they really tell us about what's going on in China, because they're so Shanghai specific and they're all produced in one little corner of that city, and more so in international concessions, but nonetheless they broaden the imaginary of a vast readership outside of the city itself. So I think that's one of the ways that modernity, that imaginary of the modern traveled. And in response to what Jeff was saying, this anxiety about modernity today, I mean, clearly the pace at which things are changing is phenomenal. But, when you go back to the late Qing and, knocking down temples to put up modern schools, or a railway coming through and destroying communities, that anxiety, that resistance has been there. So it would be interesting to see if this really is new and what is generating this sort of anti-modernity discourse today, and if it really is something new and unique.
So a city does not have to be completely free of anxiety in order to be a happy place. It's okay. Yes? Other questions? Here's the hand.
First of all, thank you very much for today. It's been really stimulating. I'm trying to keep this really simple. I guess you raised so many questions at the end of this whole day. It's so wonderful. And one of the things I was wondering about, and maybe something you might think about or address, it has to do with Shanghai's this idea of popular culture there, and whether it's modern or whether it's 1700s or whatever, but somehow the value of popular culture being something very, in a sense, subversive and revolutionary. And if, although we think about technology today and everything from comics to hip hop being everywhere, how there was something very special about the Shanghai pop, in the sense of it being creativity being brought up over and over again today, and how much I'd love to see that even further dissected. Maybe I was thinking of when we saw the black bodies tapping, and what would have been the reaction of that audience there, and was there then a time for people to get up and dance? Was there what were those moments like? So to just press that a little bit further about that idea of a very particular kind of creativity that wasn't necessarily the deep poetic kind of beauty, but this effervescence, and yet it's extremely weighty and important.
Mm-hmm. That's a terrific question. Unfortunately, I've not done enough research in that area. My one quick observation or response would be this. In Shanghai, historically, right, setting aside all the beautiful things that we have seen today, the history of Shanghai over the course of the past 150 years actually had not really been a happy one. That is, Shanghai became a major city thanks to the Taiping uprising, the international and the French concessions were spared, but the Chinese part of Shanghai, well, experienced uprisings. And then from that point onward, this was a city that had seen things like economic crises. The very first round of serious banking crisis took place in the 1880s. And of course, Shanghai was at the epicenter in the late 20s and early 1930s of China's share of the worldwide depression. And quite apart, in addition to that, say during a period of about 3 months, over civilian plus military casualties in the outskirts of Shanghai over a period of 3 months in 1937 was in a neighborhood of 500,000 individuals. I mean, I occasionally, when I stayed in Shanghai in a hotel room all by myself, I couldn't help wondering, gee, what might have happened here? Did the Japanese use this building as an internment camp for, say, foreign nationals, for instance? Or how many dead bodies had been picked up right outside on streets? We know that in the 1940s, it was routinely happening that every morning the French concession police, just because they were the studious ones who kept count, would report something like maybe about 200 dead bodies on the street that they picked up and then they shipped off and they record. Now that was nearly before 1949. After 1949, well, it wasn't for nothing that Shanghai was the birthplace of the Chinese Communist Party. And Cultural Revolution in Shanghai was a particularly interesting or intriguing chapter. So my whole point here is simply to say that Shanghai historically had not been a happy place. And yet it's quite remarkable that people managed to laugh. But this laughter does not necessarily mean happiness. And nor does it have to be imperatively, uniformly so, that when people go through things like revolutions, warfare, massacres, famine, rationing of foods, black market, the collapse of the financial market, and massive and other disasters on massive scale, that they simply respond in one way. So popular culture in that regard, especially at the street level, they very often capture that kind of complexity in experience as well as in sentiments. And that, of course, all these things like xiangsheng, the storytelling, street level performances, especially the type that people improvise, drawing on current events, that certainly would stand out as an area for us to look for, looking for evidence of the tremendous resilience as well as productivity and creativity of the people of Shanghai. So I don't know if, I've not done the kind of research that you might have in mind, so my apologies for a roundabout response. Other, no? No one? We've got about 2 minutes. Michael?
I guess the other thing that may be a little uncomfortable about a session like this is looking at Shanghai basically as a receiver of foreign influence, as foreign influence, and not an active participant in its own development, or also an active participant in the broader international scene. If you look at Art Deco furniture, for example, and you're looking at Art Deco as it develops in Paris, one of the major sources of influence or stylistic development was from China. And there was an increasing interest in China versus Japan as what does Asia look like, or what do things Asian look like. For San Francisco, when you were talking about the relationship of San Francisco, I mean, one of the reasons that San Francisco came out of the dust and ashes of 1906 earthquake, it was because of trade between San Francisco and East Asia. If you look at Ruhr China and the images of Ruhr China, and China as part of the international communist movement, Shanghai was a big part of an international movement. It wasn't just a receiver, it was an active participant in international events. So sometimes looking at Shanghai as a receiver of influences or of a globalization, it was an active participant as well. It actually was spreading things out as well as bringing things in.
Thank you. Other comments? So how many of us are going to visit the expo? Or shall we say, how many of us are determined not to be there? No? All right, so on that note, thank you very much for your participation, and a round of applause.